Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning if you are participating from the US. My name is Herman Knott. I'm a partner at Andersen Tax Legal, offering tax advisory and legal services in more than 50 countries in the world. And I would like to welcome you very much to this panel today, to this video session today, which is entitled Pervasive Crisis. And we want to analyze the government support programs in a world where we are faced with a huge increase of unemployment in the US and facing also a huge decrease of economic activity. How will we react, the governments? How will the businesses react to this new situation? And we have an eminent panel with us, but I would like to first welcome you all on behalf of AmCham. AmCham is the trade representative organization for its members, both German companies with US activities and vice versa from the US to Germany. And it's very active in formulating policies, making organizations, organizing meetings with government and business representatives. So we are very glad that AmCham is a co-host. Andersen Tax Legal is also a co-host with its broad range of services in the tax and legal area. And I would like to give the word to Dr. Benjamin Becker, who is the head of Amerika Haus, to also give you a word of welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Knott, and thank you to AmCham Germany and Andersen Tax Legal for another very smooth cooperation on let's call it, a timely transatlantic topic. We've worked together in the past on numerous occasions, and I'm very happy that we continue to do so in a trusted manner during these challenging times. So welcome everyone out there on behalf of Amerika Haus North Rhine-Westphalia. For those of you who don't know us yet, we are a transatlantic NGO in Germany's largest state of North Rhine-Westphalia. We usually host political discussions and cultural events with large public audiences. As this is not possible at the moment, we've turned the challenge into an opportunity and are now offering regular online programs such as this one. Among these programs is also our new series, Transatlantic Voices, Stimmen aus Amerika in Zeiten von Corona. The next edition of this series will be on cybersecurity during the coronavirus pandemic, and the invitation will follow soon. If you today did not sign up through us, that's first of all good, because audience enlargement is always great. But if you don't know us yet, and if you're not yet on the list, I can just encourage you and kindly ask you to check out our website for our offerings, to sign up for the newsletter, and we look forward to being in touch and to keeping you informed. Again, thank you to AmCham Germany, to Andersen Tax Legal, to all speakers, and of course to my colleague Katharina, who handles things in the background as we are talking. I wish us all now an insightful discussion, and now back to Dr. Herman Knott.
Thank you very much, Dr. Becker. It's a great pleasure to have Amerika Haus as a co-organizer, and I should mention that for the back support, we have also Julia Zhao of AmCham, so we will be all in very good hands. Speaking about good hands, we want to encourage you to participate with questions and comments to this program, because it's designed to be interactive. And there are actually two ways in which you can participate and ask questions. One way is to raise your hand. Then we will see that you would like to make a direct question or comment into the audience. Then you will get like a virtual mic to make your comment. The other way is to use the Q&A button and just write a question which we will see and which we will pick up. Unfortunately, if you are joining us by phone, you will not be able to raise questions, but we will read them loud if you write them in the Q&A box. So you cannot live raise questions. What we also want to do is during the session, we want to make two pollings. So we want to gather your opinion about two questions when they come up, and this will be easy by pushing the respective button. And we should also be aware that this session will be recorded and maybe published by AmCham or Amerika Haus. And with this, I would like to introduce our panelists of today, a very distinguished panel. We would start with Jim Black from Morrison & Foerster. Jim, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Herman. As Herman said, my name is Jim Black. I'm of counsel at the law firm of Morrison & Foerster. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I've been practicing about 24 years now, mainly focused on corporate advice, M&A, capital markets, and financing transactions. Most of my clients are German companies, especially Mittelstand companies. I have long ties with Germany that go back to the 1980s and high school. I worked for 10 years as a lawyer, as a partner at a major firm in Frankfurt, and headed up the U.S. corporate M&A and capital markets practice there. Here back in Washington now for 6 years. I continue to advise a lot of German companies on their U.S. Legal matters. I studied in Germany back in the 1980s, again, showing my age, at the universities of Erlangen and Regensburg. In the 1990s, I was a Robert Bosch Fellow in Berlin and worked at the BWS, the Bundesanstalt für Vereinigungsbedingte Sonderaufgaben, probably the best bureaucratic title ever invented. I did privatization work there. In addition to my law degree, I have a master's degree in German literature from the University of Virginia. I'm a member of the American Council on Germany and the primary pro bono legal advisor to the American Academy in Berlin.
Excellent, thank you. And then we have two panelists who are representative of business enterprises, both active in Europe and the US. Please, Christian Ulrich, would you like to introduce you and a little bit your company so that we know your background and your experience?
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, Herman. Again, my name is Christian Ulrich. I've focused on German, US, transatlantic business pretty much since moving from New York to Berlin back in 2002. I spent well over a decade doing M&A and corporate work at the first New York and then Washington, D.C. offices of the international law firm of Hogan Lovells, with at the time frequent visits to the various German offices. About 5 years ago, as Herman mentioned, I went in-house and joined a company by the name of Precigen. Precigen is a NASDAQ-listed clinical stage biotechnology company. At Precigen, as Deputy General Counsel, I'm in charge of domestic and international subsidiaries and also strategic transaction. And then all of a sudden now, as part of our COVID task force, I'm also dealing with our company's approach and general mitigation efforts. Quickly about the company, Precigen specializes in gene and cell therapies with a focus on CAR-T cancer treatments. And we also continue to operate a number of non-health assets after spinning a number of those back in February. And February, I think to all of us sounds now like a decade ago. But again, after spinning those out, we still maintain some energy subsidiaries and also subsidiaries in the bovine and animal production technology. I'm mentioning that not because it's very interesting, but because I think Jim and I will talk later on a little bit about the different approach that certain US states take in this COVID crisis. And briefly, as some of you as the attendees may be members as well, I wanted to mention that I've been active in the German-American business community for many years as outside pro bono general counsel of the German-American Business Council, GABC, both here in Washington as well as in Berlin, which is also how Jim and I met. Finally, Herman's timing, I think, couldn't be better for this panel. And thank you very much to Andersen Tax Legal, AmCham, and Amerika Haus, as not only my company, but also a lot of similarly situated US companies are currently actively looking into COVID-related loans under the US CARES Act, which I will comment on in more detail following Jim's presentation. And I think with that, back over to you, Herman, or to you, Jochen.
Thank you very much, Christian. And the other business representative is Jochen Linzenich. Please, Jochen, would you introduce yourself and your company?
Yes, sure. Good afternoon, good morning. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm quite happy to be part of this panel today and curious about the discussions to come. I started my career about 20 years ago in private practice as a lawyer at Andersen Legal, so the law firm from Arthur Andersen, followed by 3 years in Deloitte Legal. Before I changed the sites and joined Barilla, the world's leading pasta company, as a legal director for Europe for about 7.5 years. And since 2014, I'm now working as the Associate General Counsel for Europe, Asia, and Africa for Signode. Signode is the transit packaging division of Crown Holdings Inc., stock corporation, who is seated in Philadelphia. We are basically having more than 80 manufacturing sites around the globe. Particularly, I'm focused on Europe, which takes about 80% of my work time, and actually which you can see is that in the crisis, we very much learned that the European Union is not able to guide everyone through the crisis as a whole. So therefore, it's a very tough work now to deal with 21 production sites all over Europe. And this is also something which I really like to discuss with you today. It's the Signode transit packaging division. We make about 2 billion turnover. And what we are actually doing is we provide end-of-line packaging, which means starting from the consumables, we are building the equipment, we are providing the service. So we are one of the leading firms there and are in different aspects concerned by this COVID situation now.
Thank you very much, Jochen. A word about myself. I'm dually qualified in the US and in Germany, in New York in the US. I went to high school in the US and to law school at Penn and Stanford, and worked in New York for some time, just at the time when the wall came down. So we were very much engaged in the fund industry for investing into what was called emerging Europe. And I'm mostly working on M&A transaction, on cross-border M&A transaction and international dispute resolution. So before we go into details of the program, we want to set the agenda. So we will look at the two Reliefs Act. The German acts will probably mostly known to many participants, but we will very much look at the CARES Act from the US. Because it's a different situation. It's not a welfare state as in Germany. So many of those new regulations will be very interesting, and Jim Black will lead us through this. We will have comments then from Christian Ulrich and from Jochen Linzenich about how this impacts their companies and how it impacts transatlantic trade relations. That will be very interesting. We'll be keen to have your questions and contributions in the two ways discussed at the beginning, and we'll make a wrap-up polling. So let's start with a polling at the beginning to see, you know, who is from which side of the Atlantic if you are a business person, so that we can a little bit see which of the relief acts will impact on your business. And the question will be, are you a representative of a US-owned or US-affiliated business or not? So if not, you will be probably German or European. And if yes, you will be affiliated with a US enterprise, even if the company yourself may be a German one. Katharina, would you introduce the voting? Excellent. I think we can. Yeah, we'll still get further votes. All right, I think we can stop it here. So we have 70% non-US affiliated and 30% US affiliated. So it's a very good mix and will be a great basis for our work. You see the results, and we should now continue with the program. And I suggest that we move to the a brief overview over the German Relief Act. The German Relief Act has been passed on the 27th of March, but it affects both individuals, the employees, of course, the individual as employees with the short time allowance program, which has been extended dramatically. And of course, and this is most interesting in this context, business organizations. Business organizations, and in this regard, the timing is excellent because yesterday, the fast track KfW, which is the German state-owned development bank, the KfW fast track loan program with 100% guarantee by the state, by the federal government, has been finalized and released and also approved by the EU Commission, which is important. And this is the most direct way for enterprises between 50 and 250 employees to get access to funds. With the other programs which had been prepared and voted and are available, it's more difficult because there's always a private banking component, 10 to or 20% involved. And for this reason, the disbursements have been very difficult and could not really be made. What has been the third layer of business support has been the direct state aid, which is between 9,000 and 15,000 euro for very small sole proprietorships to small businesses up to 50 employees. So there's a very broad coverage of business support, and it's not a problem to apply for it. It's not a sign of weakness. Just the company has to be in good shape and going concern until March 1st. And then the coronavirus must be the reason why the liquidity problems, which are the sharpest affecting the government, the German economy, has risen. The other element is tax deferrals. There's no direct tax program in terms of tax reductions, but what has been approved and enacted are deferrals of tax payments and suspension of enforcement. So we have this area. We have for small businesses also protection in the way of continuous obligations which are necessary for livelihood. There you have a right to refuse payment until 30th of June, a date when we expect that those smaller enterprises and consumers will have secured financing. Another element is, which is important, is that there is a suspension for landlords' rights to terminate leases, both commercially and residential, until June 30 in case of non-payment. And there's also an important change in insolvency law. The German law knows an obligation to file for insolvency for the debtor. That obligation has been suspended also until 30th of September, so that companies can continue operating if they are negotiating, for instance, for loans to assist their businesses. So this is a brief overview of the German scheme, which is probably known at least to 70%, and even those of the 30% because they are working in Germany. And I would now like to turn to Jim and give us familiarity with the CARES Act and the accompanying legislation in the US. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Hermann. As Hermann said, I'm going to give a brief overview of what is a very, very large and complicated law, which is the main legislative act to provide relief from the pandemic is the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid Relief, and the Economic Security Act, which was also passed on March 27th. There are many different aspects to this law, some of which relate directly to the pandemic, some of which don't. Most of them are focused on giving economic relief and also improving on healthcare delivery, development of products, things like that that are necessary to respond to this health crisis and future health crises. As with the German law, I think you can look at the relief efforts in three categories. There are measures that are intended to help individuals. There are measures that are intended to help small businesses, and then there are others that are intended to help larger businesses. For individuals, as in Germany, we also have protection from eviction for tenants, which obviously is not economic relief, but is hoping to keep people in their houses or in their apartments. The main economic relief measures for individuals are direct cash payments first from the government to individuals. Now, not everybody is eligible for these payments. There's an income cap, but the vast majority of Americans will get some money. It's important to note that this is a one-time payment. It is not a repeat payment, and it is a relatively small amount of money. An adult can get up to $1,200 with an additional $500 per child. So the money that is available under this part of the CARES Act is certainly helpful for people who are in economic distress, but it is not going to sustain them for very long. The other main part of the response for individuals is an expansion of unemployment benefits. This is a program that is administered by the states. The federal government has added money to that pot to expand the amount of money that people can get, and also the length of time during which they can get unemployment benefits. I think this will be a much more significant aid to many people. But again, this is a program that is not available to everybody because of state law requirements. Not everybody is eligible to get unemployment insurance. Some of the eligibility has been expanded under the CARES Act, but there certainly will still be many people who will fall through the cracks and not get significant aid on an individual level from the CARES Act. For small businesses, the main program, there are various efforts to help small businesses, but the main program, and the one that certainly has gotten the most press coverage, is the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. This is a loan program administered by the Small Business Administration for small businesses, which is defined generally, with some exceptions, but generally as companies with a maximum of 500 employees. The loans are mainly meant to be used to pay payroll. They can also be used for some other costs like rent and utilities, but primarily the idea is to help companies continue to employ their staff to avoid layoffs. This is a short-term program. It's really meant to cover about 8 weeks of payroll, and the amounts are limited. So this is not a long-term solution. The other thing to know about this is the money is almost gone. The $349 billion that was allocated to this has almost all been spent already or allocated for loans to companies that have applied, and also for individuals and sole proprietors who have applied. So Congress will have to act to add more money to this program. The word in the media is that they're talking about another $250 billion, but that's not done yet, and we'll see what gets done. And when it gets done, there's a real chance that there will be a gap in time after the current funds run out and before new funds are available. I guess you could look at this program as somewhat comparable to the Kurzarbeit program in Germany in terms of providing funds to help companies continue to employ their employees. The structure is different. It's also different in the sense that this is an ad hoc program. This is not a pre-existing structure in the market. This was created specifically for this crisis. That also results in a lot of growing pains and ramp up issues and just logistical challenges with getting this program operational. But it is the most comparable thing that we've seen in the US market to Kurzarbeit. For mid-sized companies, there's a program referred to as the Main Street Lending Program. The Main Street Lending Program is intended to help provide financing for companies that have between 500 and 10,000 employees. So actually some pretty big companies will be eligible for this. This will be a fund that will be seeded by the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. and should have a total of about $600 billion in dry powder when it starts. This program is not operational yet. It's unclear when it will become operational. There are some challenges and some doubts in the market that it is viable as it's been announced. One of the challenges is, for example, that it mandates an interest rate that lenders would be required to use that is not based on LIBOR, but is based on SOFR, the Secured Overnight Funding Rate. As a lot of you know, we are in the process in the United States of changing from LIBOR to SOFR for all securities and other obligations. And that process is still not complete. It's meant to be completed next year. And there are a lot of lender clients that we are speaking with who are doubtful that this is workable. They're not sure that SOFR is a reliable measure yet for basing interest rates on. So that's one challenge, but there are many others for this program. So we'll see if it gets up and running and how quickly. For large businesses, the main relief effort is the CESA, the Coronavirus Economic Stabilization Act. This is a $500 billion pool of money that the Treasury Department can allocate in loans and loan guarantees, mainly to U.S. businesses, also to states and other agencies. There are some amounts that are specifically allocated to the airline industry and to national security related businesses, but the bulk of the money is available to be lent out by the Treasury in its discretion. We'll see, what they decide, who they decide to give money to, and what amounts. One really important aspect of this program is that it comes with very significant conditions, and those conditions are, for example, a limitation and almost a complete ban, but with very few exceptions, on share buybacks and dividends and executive compensation. In fact, the program as currently drafted would force some executives who are highly compensated to take a pay cut under this program going forward. And so we'll see how interested companies are to take part in this. I can imagine there will be companies who have access to private capital who will be willing to pay more for private capital in order to avoid taking this money simply because they want to avoid those limitations. So that could be a break on how effective this is in supporting the economy. Again, this program also has not really started allocating money in any major way. Just three general observations about the U.S. relief efforts. The first is of interest to probably some people on this call. Most of these programs are available to companies in the U.S. that are owned by non-U.S. shareholders. So a German company that has U.S. subsidiaries should be able to take part through their U.S. subsidiaries in a lot of these programs if they would like. There are affiliate rules for counting employee numbers to determine eligibility, for example, for the PPP program. But fundamentally, these programs are open to companies that have foreign ownership. The second point I would make is, I think it's no secret, anybody who reads the press knows that there's been a certain lack of coordination between the federal government and the states. This has affected all kinds of different things like sourcing and supply chains for testing kits and for personal protective equipment and other things that are necessary to respond to the health crisis. It's also now affecting very strongly the question of when the economy will reopen. And so this is something that I think Christian mentioned earlier that I think we'll talk more about. For companies that have operations in multiple states, this will be very challenging. I'm sure it already has been very challenging to comply with the shutdown orders that have come in different times and in different forms and different definitions in various states. I think reopening will be an equally challenging time as different states decide to reopen various parts of their economies on different timelines. Some may decide for political reasons or other reasons to reopen even against the advice of public health officials, which will raise a lot of questions for companies that operate in those states, how to respond to that, whether it's safe to ask their employees to return to work or not. And so we'll see how that plays out, but this is certainly something that's made the response more complicated and more complicated for private industry to deal with and to decide how to react. And then the last comment that I would make is Hermann mentioned that the German support programs do not come with any sort of stigma. They're not seen as any sort of indication of weakness if a company decides to take part in these programs. In the US, the programs that have been put in place generally require companies to certify that they are in financial distress and need the funds from the government essentially to continue their ongoing operations. And the language is different in the different programs, but there's a lot of concern among companies, and a lot of our clients are asking us to help them think through these issues, how this will be perceived in the market if you take advantage of these programs, and particularly for public companies. And I think Christian has mentioned this in our private conversations, and may have something to say about this. Just as a general matter, you know, this is a real question in the US market, whether it will be positively perceived or negatively perceived for companies who access these funds because they have made these certifications, and what that says about the continued viability of the company. So with that, I will turn it over to Christian. I hope I didn't steal your thunder too much.
No, thank you, Jim. So I'll get to this certification point in a second, but the more general comments I wanted to make, first of all, there's real urgency. I'll be speaking first about really, for most, what I do and what similarly situated companies face is under the PPP, the Payment Protection Program. We are all told there's a lot of urgency. Jim was mentioning the current appropriated funds are about to run out, and this has been in 13 days that the whole program has been in place. So we are all told, and I don't know if you're speaking, you as audience are speaking to your US colleagues, if there are US subsidiaries, if they are planning on applying under the PPP, they should really get it in front of their boards, talk to management in the next day or two to do this. Jim mentioned there's talk about an additional $250 billion, $250 billion of allocation under this program, but when that happens, it's uncertain. We see a large number of private enterprises and also of smaller public companies applying under the PPP. You know, my company and similarly situated companies are looking into this actively, but also to give you a sense, also my kids' soccer club, Fußballverein, is applying to this as a nonprofit, and they're waiting for a response because this really matters for their own operations. In the implementation, Jim, this is one other aspect I wanted to say that we're facing. It is also hard you said it's an ad hoc program, so structures were not in place, which means the banks as lenders are facing a real rush of incoming applications. So we're told right now that it's not the larger banks that can handle these well, it's actually the small community banks that are taking on a lot of these larger loans under the PPP. It sounds maybe paradoxical or counterintuitive, but that's what we're seeing. Normally, banks have a lot of detailed KYC, know your client requirements. Some of those are being waived. So point one was there's a real urgency, and we can talk more about that. The second one is really the point you mentioned, the certification and what I would call the potential scrutiny and reputational problems that come with something like an application for a smaller public company under the PPP. So again, we're not just talking about companies with employees up to 500. There's some technology, biotechnology exceptions where these companies can have up to 1,000 employees. And you must think about it this way. You really go out to the market in this application and will have stated that but for this loan, this PPP loan, your company would have had a hard time to continue operations in their current way, to meet payroll, to meet payments of rent, utilities, and the like. So with our periodic filings that we have to do as a public company, that others have to do, it is something to consider. What signals does that send to analysts, to investors, to shareholders, right, Jim? Secondly, it's not just the eligibility under this program, the PPP, the important part of getting cheap money, essentially. The more important part is also if you're thinking about applying for forgiveness under that loan and showing that you haven't laid off or reduced salaries significantly, do you face scrutiny, audit afterwards? Are you exposed under the False Claims Act, in fact, if you changed course? And so you'll probably talk more, Jim. I'd like to hear more what you see with other similarly placed US companies if they've really gone out, made these 8K filings, and said, yes, we want to apply under this. And right now, just to the audience, there's very little guidance. This has all been put in place very recently. So we make a good faith determination at this point. Do we need this kind of funding in order to, in our estimation, avoid layoffs, avoid payment reduction? I think as Hermann noted initially, the stigma, this kind of approach would not be applicable in Germany. There would be a general approach that, yes, if you can tap into these funds, companies should and would do it. That's a big difference. The second somewhat technical point, and Jim alluded to that, are these affiliation rules. So not only do you have to, in these filings, talk about your own company, if there's a 20% generally interest of a stakeholder in your company, or you hold this 20% stake, you have to also disclose about them in these filings. So you have to closely coordinate with your partners, with your stakeholders. If you make a filing, if you also make a filing, do you disclose it the same way? Is it consistent? So what we've seen actually with larger companies, larger public companies, some that the audience may well know in the fast food industry, for example, it's not the parent company applying for these loans, it's pushing or asking their franchisees to actually apply under the PPP. The third quick point was, again, the differences and lack of coordination between the federal, state, and the state approach. So if your clients or if your colleagues to the audience have subsidiaries in different states, and I'm generalizing a little bit, let's say operations on the West Coast and operations in say, the Midwest where we have operations, we see the level of shutdown that impacts, for example, as a real consequence that Hermann asked about, to our clinical trials, enrollment, data analysis for our clinical trials in hospitals in the West Coast, Washington State, California, to be vastly more complicated than, say, our agricultural operations in Iowa, where until very, very recently, there was hardly any stay-at-home order, or agricultural business is deemed so essential that everybody is still operating. So, and that is, that is different for us to gauge. What we have seen is a supply chain issue, and this is something I think Jochen will be talking about for Germany or for the US as well. We see third parties coming to us and asking under force majeure clauses saying, this pandemic would allow us not to take your product. And so we're really looking, and this is what a lot of companies are facing, does the pandemic qualify third parties, partners to reject delivery because of the crisis? And lastly, what I've seen, this is my last point, then I'll turn it over to Jochen. The unemployment filings and the unemployment numbers in the US are simply staggering. The last I checked last night was since the beginning of the crisis, so in the last 4 weeks here in the US, 22 million jobs have been lost. The unofficial employment rate is well around 15%, ticking up to 20%. And I believe thanks to Kurzarbeitergeld and other approaches in Germany, and Hermann may be able to comment on that, you wouldn't see those kind of numbers rising in Germany at this point.
It's very true. It's very true, Christian, because the Kurzarbeitergeld actually, defers unemployment or avoids entirely, depending on how quickly we will emerge from this crisis, because it's 12 months, not 8 weeks, and there are even plans to extend it to 24 months, and the application process is quite simple, and people are used to it because there are other situations in which they have already done this. So it's quite an accustomed system and not an ad hoc system. Perhaps before we move on to Jochen, one question to complete the picture. Are there any, you mentioned the airlines, Jim, are there any other industries which of which you are aware that have specific protection, like the oil industry with all the with the slump of the oil price? That may be a problem. Is there anything you are aware of for special industries to better understand the US situation?
So there is, outside of the CARES Act, there's certainly consideration of assistance to a lot of different industries. The energy industry, I have not heard of any significant effort to aid them. And we've already started to see the first bankruptcies of shale gas producers. So I think there's going to be a wave of bankruptcies in that space. The other major industry that is getting relief, specifically related to the pandemic, is what's referred to as national security related businesses. Now, that is a broad definition and can include a lot of different things, but broadly speaking, those are probably sensitive government contractors and other companies that provide critical infrastructure to the government or to support the national security. But those are the main specific industries that have programs devoted to them.
The one thing I can add to your question about airlines, Hermann, is the number I've read, and this is, I believe our audience, many of them will be members of the Star Alliance, United and Lufthansa Corporation. United Airlines alone will be tapping into a relief payment of round about $5 billion US. And so to give you that as a magnitude, I don't know if you would compare it to what Lufthansa and others in Europe would receive. I thought that number was pretty impressive.
Well, with Lufthansa, it looks like it will be the state will actually taking over it, at least temporarily. And we have seen perhaps that such drastic state action, and we have seen in the financial crisis, may be a helpful tool to assist arriving at quick recovery. Jochen, maybe you can describe from your perspective, being based in Europe for a US parent company with German, of course, local companies. What is your experience and in this respect?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Hermann. So first of all, I want to come back to my comment from the beginning that basically providing advice to a US parent company about Europe is quite difficult, considering that, as I said, the EU is not, let's say, providing any guidance which the countries follow or would like to follow. So basically, every country is looking on its own. This makes our work actually very complicated. So on first side, I'm not working as a lawyer these days. I'm more a manager, in particular when it comes to figuring out the situations in each countries. That's also the reason why we implemented a task force Europe, which meets every day, and we defined country heads in each country which report into a tool with their information on each country, and which we then discuss every day at noontime and late in the evening. So for the US, early afternoon, the head of our task force is then reporting our results to US, so that the information is there as well. And on the other way around, we get also the information from the Americas. So that's a very important point in order to be able to tell and to agree, and in particular to roll out guidelines. Having said this, I would like to stick a little bit more on getting into the commercial issues we are focusing on. And this is, Christian, what you already mentioned, is the force majeure issue is, of course, one of the topics in these days. In particular, as we have so many companies around Europe who are, let's say, producing and facing situations where the force majeure issue could go up. Our business, fortunately, is a quite stable one, considering that lots of our clients are in the food sector. So that's the reason why, let's say, there's still a lot of need. Just the machinery business becomes a little bit more complicated, but we are quite in a good position. But nevertheless, we are preparing also for the next month. So that's the reason why we focus on these force majeure clauses. And when we hear about this force majeure clause, I think everyone has heard about it. And yeah, we have this kind of clause, but it's not just that we are talking about a force majeure event now, which is defined as an unforeseen event beyond the reasonable control of the parties. Because when we see whatever business we are doing in these days, the first question we would need to answer is this still an unforeseen event? Or are we already in a pandemic, which could be, or from my point of view, it is a force majeure event, but it's no longer unforeseen. So this was our first question we discussed, and came to the conclusion that for that reason, we need to provide an additional wording which states that although this is no longer unforeseen, because whatever happens in the next days, it might be that we will not be able to produce anymore because times are difficult. that we insert a wording which provides a sort of grandfathering of this rule, stating that although we are already in a pandemic, the parties agree that this is still a force majeure event, and every measures therefrom lead to the applicability of this clause. This is important. This we discussed with our sales teams, and the sales teams then were requested to input this in every order confirmation we're doing or offers we are sending out. Because the second point is, when you ask your sales teams about, do we have the force majeure clause in place in this contractual relationship, they generally would say, oh yes, of course, it's in our T's and C's. But the problem is then you have to ask the second questions, are the T's and C really implemented into the agreements? And then you have to evaluate each time the specific case. And if you are an industry where we are in selling consumables, for example, to very, very huge customers, it's always, of course, the market power of the customer that he sticks to his terms and conditions for purchase, and we don't get our terms and conditions for sales implemented. For this occasion, we agreed that the sales team also need to put the general clause on force majeure also on order confirmation and individually negotiate with the customers that this clause is in, because often it's very difficult to implement the terms and conditions. And in this specific case, considering also that we have thousands of customers, so the legal department does not have any contract management tool or can oversee every contract we are entering in, it's very important that people should have an eye on the actual situation and not just saying, yeah, we have in our T's and C's a force majeure clause. So this is basically what was a very huge effort we did over the last weeks in order to be prepared with this one. A second point is, which is of course also to mention, is I think everyone did this exercise 2 years ago already, I think, yeah, the implementation of the GDPR, so the European Data Protection Law. And you have to see, when you currently are in the situation that you have to protect your employees, but on the other hand, you also have to protect the data protection law, right? And to protect the individual, that all his data is safe, which generally is of course done because we follow this law, everything is placed. But just to give an example, what we were discussing in Europe is also when this discussion a week or so ago, it was very often in the press about these to check people when entering the production site on temperature. In the end, we come to the conclusion that this is not possible under GDPR, although there is, of course, a measure with which we want to secure our people. Same discussion you can lead when we're talking about wearing masks when coming to the office. What kind of mask should it be? Second point is, in most of the European countries, Christian, Jim, maybe you can tell us in the US, I think it should be the same, if I understand my colleagues correctly. When we're talking about the very professional masks, these should go to the hospitals and to everyone who really needs it in the day-by-day work with infected people. So if you say, okay, you should wear a mask, then you need to provide a solution on what kind of mask they should wear. And when people with a mask, for example, let's take the very simple example of a scarf, that they take a scarf and come into a production site, then of course you are immediately in a problem talking about health and safety regulations in a production site. So these are just some ideas how critical is also to see the relation between data protection law and the health and safety of our people. A further interesting point is what we heard is, we also discussed, of course, what is really an essential business, which could, let's say, essential business, and could we leave our production sites open in case countries go for very strong measures. We don't have any production in Italy, but just as an example, because one of my colleagues told me that in the region of Milan, you know, where it was really problematic around Bergamo and Brescia, the authorities simply looked into the business purpose, which is registered with the commercial registry. And if this business purpose was not that perfectly describing the things you are producing, then they simply shut down your business. And it could also be that you are producing, for example, a packaging which would be suitable and also essential business. They simply shut it down because they didn't have time to check each case, which also lead to the fact that we, in all our European entities, check if the business purpose is in line with what we are doing, which fortunately was the case. But also another point where we have to be always aware of, that the business, although it's just in the articles of association, right? Sometimes nobody looks after the articles of association, but in these really difficult situations, it could become a severe problem. So this is also what we looked into it, and what we are preparing actually when we are talking about these points here in Europe. Maybe one last comment which could also be of interest. My company has a very material business in India, and you know that India is one of the most strongest shutdowns since weeks, which is also prolonged. We are essential business, so for us we can still produce, but with less people and with a lot of safety measures which we need to keep. So that's fine, but logistics becomes very critical. So really passing borders and also streets are it's extremely trafficked. Just carrying goods is possible. So it's very difficult to get your people to the production sites. You need certificates. So it's everything's running there. We still also see that supply chains also in other businesses are still working in India, but it gets more and more complicated, right? So I think the first quarter, a lot of companies had still an order entry which came from January or February, but second quarter will for sure, I think, all over the world much more difficult, and then these points I raised before will become even more important.
Well, yeah, Jochen, your example with the commercial register is really an example for the adage, hard cases make bad law. Yeah. Do you want to add a word about supply chain? Because I think your company, Signode, is very dependent on supplies, because you have mass production much more than others. Do you want to have a word about the maintenance of the supply chain and how you monitor this and how you react?
Yeah, this is of course also one part of our task force, and we have our sourcing team of working 24 hours on to secure deliveries. And just the feedback is that this is still working, but it's getting of course more and more complicated. We of course looking always for solutions and have a 1B, 1C delivery possibility, but this gets complicated. But up to now, fortunately for us, it's still okay.
Great, great. Maybe we should open for questions, the floor for questions, either way, either by writing in the question and answer block or by raising the hands to discuss your questions. Okay, maybe we make another voting then, as you see on the screen, because this may also cause some discussion if we would prepare the voting for this last question. This is really something which is not limited to business persons. Taking a longer term perspective, do you think transatlantic business will be hurt by the country-focused economic policies we have been seeing now and in the recent past? Of course, now all these laws are very national. We have heard from Jochen and from Christian that the EU is really not active in this field because every country is concentrating on its own business. And but the transatlantic, the flow of trade is open. There's no limit, and also the laws apply to, they don't look at nationalities of companies or people involved. So actually we do have open borders in terms of trade, but not in terms of moving people. And therefore we would, and transatlantic trade has been one of the cornerstones of the post-war history, especially of Germany and the US. And therefore, we need to see beyond all day-to-day rhetoric, what will be the impact of economic policies. So let's keep it open for a moment to see your responses. So we can see that 64% of our attendants have voted that the relations will be negatively affected by the current economic policies. I guess it's correspondingly 36% think it will not be the case. I think probably it's a mixture of responses based on previous trade policies and responses based on current relief acts, which of course are very much based on national and domestic events, domestic policy goals, look at the protection of certain industries where the transnational, the cross-border interests are of less relevance and weight. So maybe we would ask the panelists to comment a word on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think, you know, there certainly are ways in which the response to this crisis is dovetailing with the existing kind of America First approach of certain parts, at least, of the federal government. You know, there are provisions included in the Treasury program for large businesses that require companies to, where possible, buy American, for example. There's a lot of discussion, obviously, for good reason, probably, about repatriating, in a sense, some of the supply chain for pharmaceuticals and medical devices, because we've seen that our dependence on, even for domestic manufacturers of pharmaceuticals and devices, the dependence on China in particular, but also other markets for components and ingredients has been a real issue. And so I think that this is giving additional fuel to the nationalistic, protectionistic fire that's been burning, and which I think is very unfortunate. But I do think that there will be a certain pulling back from globalization as a result of this, and as you know, as it complements other existing trends in our politics.
And the only thing I can add to that, Jim, as one example, you also see from a trade perspective, companies that would have otherwise been in a difficult situation prior to the crisis anyway, like Boeing, because of reasons that we all know about, in respect of the trade relationship, and they have, in terms of subsidies they would receive under this, where Airbus was really sort of in a much better position. We can't anticipate what happens after the crisis, right? I mean, after the crisis, are trade rules enforced the same way? So I could see this also leading to a change in global trade policy. I still believe, as a sort of transatlantic believer, that our relationship will continue to be very strong, but it will certainly look very different.
One aspect which is very important, and which I read in the German press, and maybe it would be interesting to comment on it from a transatlantic perspective, because the US is always known as a very flexible economy. Look at how quickly, in the end, I think maybe this is only my impression, but I thought the testing, for instance, was built up quite quickly. But how can we use this kind of new startup of the economy? How we can use this to promote innovation? The German auto industry is asking the government to create incentives for buying climate-friendly cars and similar incentives. And how do you see it from a US perspective, or even for German-American trade? What could be the role of innovation as a new locomotive for change in the return of the economy?
I think from my perspective, I think to start with, you know, I think that there's been a lot of discussion in the press, particularly by some public officials, that testing has surged in the U.S. That's true in terms of absolute numbers, but we're still far behind the testing as a percentage of population compared to other countries, Germany being one of them. South Korea is the best example. So I think there's, we're still behind the curve on some of these things, and including on very simple things like swabs for taking samples. And so I don't think that I think we're seeing the beginning of a national effort in private industry to find solutions, and whether that's General Motors making respirators or other things, or ventilators, but I don't know that we've really seen a resurgence yet, and it is a very interesting question what the lasting effect of that will be. And I certainly think that the U.S. operations of non-U.S. companies have a major role to play in that, including U.S. subsidiaries of German companies. So I think there are some ways that this will reinforce transatlantic trade and relations as innovative companies find ways to innovate and solve problems.
Excellent, excellent. Jochen or Jim, any comments on this? Because
maybe one comment from my side is just what I see is basically also that companies are getting forced to go digital. What we are doing here, and then what I don't know how many meetings we did now with Microsoft Teams or somebody else. So it's really nice to see that this works. Obviously, now also, let's say I'm coming from an old industry, right? So therefore, we are also seeing really that we're going more digital. Also, the home office thing works much better. This is also for my company was not the general case that people could work from home now, but with all these tools we now have, I think this could also provide a push forward to be even more effective in future when using these tools.
Yeah, my only, I guess, last comment there is I agree with Jim that we are sort of late in this. We unfortunately got, both from a technology side and from a general response side, got a very late start, but I'm optimistic when you read now about contact tracing cooperation between Google and Apple and others that you've read about in the press. I think we will come out of this with some innovative approaches. The same as Jochen mentioned for our company as well. We've seen this as an opportunity to cooperate. We are spread around a number of offices in the States and globally in Belgium and Germany. So there could be opportunities, but I think it's way too early to tell from my perspective.
Thank you very much. But I think we can at least conclude from this that a crisis has an element of danger and it has an element of opportunity. And moving towards the exit sooner or later, I think we will much more discuss the opportunities, although they are a big way forward for us with the high unemployment rate, with the slump in growth, which is enormous, and but maybe it gives us the opportunity to start differently. There's a question from Thomas Kenny from how the slides will be available. We will make them, of course, available. Either we'll put them on the websites of AmCham Amerika Haus or ourselves, or we will send them because we have all the contact details in an email. So please, we'll take up this issue and we will certainly make them available for your further considerations. I think with no further question being raised, I think we had a very interesting discussion. I thank very much our experienced panelists to contribute in a very interesting discussion, all their experience and the experience of their companies. I thank everyone from the audience to participate. And I'm most grateful also to the support in the background from Julia Zhao and Katharina Kiefel and the two organizations, AmCham and Amerika Haus. And I hope we'll all have the chance to get together very soon again under improved circumstances. Thank you very much and have a good evening or a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.